My name is Joseph Wunderlich. I'm a professor of engineering, architecture, and computer science. This is part 3 of a 7-part lecture series on architecture design theory. Each part of this lecture series is available in a number of different file formats. There are links that you can click on in the PDFs and the PowerPoints, not in the YouTube or MP4. However, on the YouTube videos, you'll see in the comments a link to the PDF and the PowerPoints. These are the sources. The main course textbooks is a Frank Lloyd Wright book on the natural house, and with reference to a lecture series that I've finalized pretty much in 2018 after teaching related material for a while. And then, most importantly, in this course, the Ching textbook on architecture, form, space, and order. So firstly, form and space. We organize in the positive shapes and negative backgrounds, and then we grow elements around them. And so the background and the foreground is a unity of opposites. So you think of both the positive and negative space. And form occurs at the junction between mass and space. See the mass containing a volume of space as well as the form of the volume itself. So for example, you look at this floor plan, this footprint, and the relationship of the mass and space exists at several scales, not only form, but its impact on space. And then we're talking about architecture and urban design. So at an urban scale, a building is part of the fabric defining streets and squares. Or in plan view here, you can see it standing alone. And then we read the walls as elements, and the space in between should not be simply background for the walls, but also forms. So you really want to look at the negative space as well as the positive space. So we're going to start with the basic elements of the form. And so we have a ground plane and the floor plane, not always the same thing, typically not. So the elevation of the site and the terrain of the site, and how that's graded versus the floor plane of the structure. And the way these planes relate, the elevated or sunken planes. The elevated plane separates from surroundings and creates a domain with larger spatial context. And the vertical edges help. And then the sunken plane, that's a different effect, and defines a volume of space isolated from a larger context. And then the plane overhead defines a volume of space beneath. So like a tree, a canopy, you can imagine that. So in site design, the surface articulation of the ground or floor plane is often used in architecture to define a zone of space within a larger context. So you see the paths of movement and the places of rest. We learn in urban design about paths and nodes and edges and landmarks and districts. And then the field from which the form of a building rises out of the ground. So your topography, your site, it certainly relates to the building. And then on the interior, in the last slide here, articulate the functional zone within a one-room living room with the way the carpet is situated. So now in site design, we want to think about the terrain and how we're placing our form, our building. It can be embedded into the earth. Frank Lloyd Wright would want to do that. The Taliesin, the brow of the site of the hill. Don't destroy the hill by putting the building on top, he would say. In the second one, you could reform the topology of the site with your cut and fill. A standing tower marks a position in space. You can bridge across the space. You can terrace, expand the ground plane and use those planes to your purpose. You can extend yourself way out and appear in the space, or stand free like a pavilion in a meadow. So, for example, here's the ground plane penetrating a buffer against undesirable conditions. An earthen structure with a green roof. With terracing, your ground plane can be elevated to establish a podium. Your ground plane can be cut into the earth, into the site, to honor a sacred or significant place. Could be terraced here. This is San Francisco, where I lived in late 1980s. Renovated a little Victorian across the street. Worked as a consulting engineer. Also started in high tech as a physics grad. Taught astronomy while in San Francisco. This is in the Presidio Heights. Just over the hill there, you can see the Golden Gate Bridge. This is the San Francisco Bay. The yellow circle is where I lived. See the terracing of the ground plane. And the project across the street from where I lived. The ground plane can step to allow changes in elevation easily traversed. The Spanish Steps in Rome. Beautiful, beautiful place. All of Rome. Been to Italy 6 times. Avoided Rome until later on, and I thought it would be a big kind of noisy city, but it's absolutely beautiful. It's isolated into little neighborhoods and pockets of extreme beauty. This is in Hawaii. I did not take this picture, but I've been to Hawaii a number of times. Maui and Kauai and Oahu several times. Floor plan can be rendered as a neutral ground against which other elements in space are seen as figures. So as a backdrop to accentuate the figures, the sculptures in this case. The floor plan can be sunken down, and it creates a different effect, whether it's isolating or down below here, down the hole, or if it's something just shallow depth, you can sit on the edge of it, you see at the top. So, sunken living room is an example that you might want to do for the effect you're going for in your design. This is a library, sunken. Very similar to a library that when I was in the 1970s, they tore down an old historic library. I wasn't very happy about it. But they built a hemicircle, Frank Lloyd Wright inspired kind of design, and I found old plans in the new plans in the old building, and that's one of my early inspirations in architecture. So library. The old library, actually, more than the new one, but then the new one also in the 1970s and 60s, actually, born in 61. Sunken living room. So you see the effect here. Right? If it was any deeper, it'd be a hole. It wouldn't be part of the space. But this works well. You want to think of the sun angles all the time, orchestrating the sun, right? Part of Frank Lloyd Wright's organic design, as well as good solar design in general for the Chinese in the 6th century or the Romans 2,000 years ago, worrying about the sun angles, as well as present-day leadership in energy and environmental design certifications. So you think about the sun and where the light will go. You get too deep of a hole, light's not really getting in there, or the views. But if you make the expanse enough, it will get in. Here's an amphitheater in Greece, sunken ground plane, 2,400 years ago. And so now elevating the plane and the effects that you can get there. So first, you're up high. This person's sitting up high. The edge of the field is well defined. Visual spatial continuity maintained. Physical access is easily accommodated. You can walk up there. So you want to think about that. The steps are too steep. If you've ever been in a stadium where the steps are too steep, it'll give you vertigo, first of all, if you're in an upper deck. It does for me. But there's a scale, a proportion that works, and then one that doesn't. So talk about the second one, maintaining visual continuity also makes a difference in the perception of the space. And then lastly, visual and spatial continuity is interrupted if you're up too high. So you realize now this is a whole separate floor. So the difference between split levels and how that works psychologically, architecturally, and then when you want a separation by floors. You do that by design. So now elevated planes. You can do that for a purpose here. Ceremonial spaces. Here's an elevated plane in Kyoto. Took this picture, and it's intentional here for a sacred space. Here's another one, Emperor's Palace, Emperor's Seat of Honor. This is common in altars to raise the space, raise the plane. And there's just an example of where my wife and I got married in 1988. We met in '86 at University of California, San Diego. I was urban design major. I just finished working several years for developers, managing all the architecture, engineering, and construction of $100 million of real estate development in Texas and California, and then decided to go into urban planning, urban design. I worked as an urban planner for San Diego County while I was going to school for approximately 2 years. I almost finished the second degree, but then decided to go into grad school. I finished with 200 credits of architecture and urban design before I ever started getting into high tech. But anyway, so now the roof plane, the overhead plane can be a roof, shelters, the interior. It can be not a solid surface, so arbors, that's a great effect, especially in warm climates. In California, this is very common. You want to be outside, or the lanai, the outside porch in Hawaii. You want to block the direct sunlight, but still create a space by virtue of the overhead plane. So arbors, trellises, pergolas, sunlight and breeze gets through. Talk about this in the green architectural engineering course I teach, and passive heating and cooling. Right? Let the air through, as well as good airflow, ventilation. Not a bad idea, even when there's in wintertime and diseases and things, viruses, right? Roof plane can emerge with the walls to emphasize the volume of the building mass. We do massing models in architecture, and this is what you see, what you get. You see the relationship between adjacent buildings and the overall form, and how it impacts the fabric of the urban design. Roof plane can be considered like a hat on the building, articulates the space underneath. It can be expressed as a single sheltered form that encompasses a variety of spaces within the canopy. So this is common. You don't see this in the United States much. We stayed in Kyoto for a couple of weeks, my son and I, and this is a common thing to do in Japan. You just declare a street a shopping street, no cars, put an overhead roof over it, and you've got essentially a mall. And it actually works better, in my opinion, than the separate shopping mall that you drive to, because it's in the fabric of the community already. It was part of this little neighborhood we stayed in Kyoto. Now, that's not this specific picture. I probably could insert a picture of that here. Probably should. And so, yes, I have inserted a slide here of the shopping street in Kyoto, in the neighborhood we stayed at for approximately 2 weeks. And you can find links to it in PowerPoint with audio and MP4, YouTube and PDF. And then you'll see on here some key words given to me by my friend Mahawa Bhattacharya, a colleague, who's a professor of Japanese, and these are keywords that discussing in this lecture. You can go in and see more here. So I would say for this one, so I have not all the keywords she gave me, but ones that I think apply to this slide. So being considerate of each other and the space. The Japanese are very much aware and very much considerate of the personal space between each other. Even in Tokyo, when it gets super crowded and you're jammed in the subways, I jammed in not Tokyo, but in Osaka. Yeah, it was Osaka. But yeah, they're very considerate of space. And then empathy, feeling each other's pain and emotions. Insider and outsider, yes, but you be polite about it. You won't be a Japanese person when you visit Japan, unless you are Japanese, native Japanese, and so that you do feel, but it's not in an adversarial way. Modesty, certainly, you don't want to be too prideful and boastful and loud. Be humble too. Just try to speak some Japanese, and then show some restraint. So as I'm passing this woman here sweeping, I'm very much aware that she's cleaning this space and that I don't want to trample on what she's doing or even get in her space in any way. So I'm not moving fast or abrupt, and I think she appreciated that. And this is the shopping street. You see it's covered, and it functions great. Everything you'd actually need day to day. This is something you might want to come back to, the Japanology. If you've been in my courses before, you know that NHK Tokyo Japanese channel, Japanology, and Japanology Plus One, they're really, really good things to watch. And this is a particular exercise in the architecture theory course. If you're watching this lecture in a part of another course, you don't need to do this, but in architecture theory course, we do. For roofs, we're talking about roofs now, roof planes. And so they examine the different kinds of roofs. These are British roofs. Look at the Japanese type roofs. In this offering of this course, this one offering, we had specification writing for the number of students, specifically the engineers in there, and we adhered to the master format, the Construction Specifier Institute, also adapted by AIA and typically American Institute of Architects. And these are the 16 original divisions that I was used to in my youth, and then everything switched to the more specified, more divided into more sections, more divisions, which is now the standard everybody uses. In the second sample assignment, the students design a residence with a clerestory window, and it should shine on a thermal mass wall. The window should be oriented towards the south, and they need to show how the light changes at the noon on the winter solstice as well as the summer solstice. And they also need to design a green roof. So to the forms, now we're talking about the planes and the overhead planes, defining the space below. You can see how that works with a curved space and how that relates to the space below. It's not just a structural thing, it's defining the space within. And you can manipulate those spaces, of course, in your design, whether you're doing trusses or joists, steel joists, or masonry vault. You can see how each of these different overhead planes, ceiling planes, define the spaces below. You can also sense the structure above and what this form will look like outside of the space. This is a picture from Venice. I've been there 4 times. I've been in Italy 6 times, taught at the University of Trento in Trentino Alto, and also a relationship with the Pantheon Institute in Rome. There's 6 different schools I've relationship with, but a very good relationship with 2 of those universities. And Venice is my favorite place to go. My son took this picture, and he went with me twice. I think 2014 maybe he took this picture. And then my son took this picture. This is Belgium, Mons. My uncle ran a lab there, EMP lab for NATO SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. This is my aunt Barbara. She's a professional ballerina in the Royal Ballet, or she was. Taught ballet to the people that work in the NATO. This is the Sistine Chapel, and I didn't take this picture. This is out of the book, but this is worth spending some time. It certainly defines the space. When you go in, I sat in there for over an hour just watching people, essentially, as well as the space. The ceiling can make a big difference. This is in Frank Lloyd Wright, Oak Park, his home and studio. This is talked about this before, and it's certainly worth a visit. And the tour guide was excellent there. This picture is taken from the balcony, and looking down where the children, 6 children he had, would put on plays. People would watch. There's a piano below the balcony, built into over the stairwell beneath, and the music would flow throughout the house. This is a picture of me and my son Joseph took in Windsor, Old Windsor, England. We were presenting a paper there in London. This is a boys' school, boarding school, converted into a hotel. See how that defines the space. This is in Padua, outside of Venice. Certainly a place to watch, to see in itself. I have now good friends. A professor friend and his wife, also a professor, live in Padua. And at first I was a little reluctant to go because I just kept wanting to go back to Venice. I've been there 4 times. I just want to see more Venice. But they convinced me to stay for a while. And it was great. It's an experience in itself. Every city in Italy is an experience in itself. But I highly recommend Padova, Italy. It's a picture in Kyoto with my son. I was presenting as a keynote speaker there for an hour. My son was also on the stage because he contributed to the work. And you see the detail here, not only in the form and the shape, but look at how this is built. I mean, that makes you think about it and makes you feel that space. Kind of propels you through it in a spiral-like way. Very difficult way to lay brick like this. I think they did it purely for architectural reasons. I don't see a real structural benefit. There's a railroad track above. It certainly needs to hold up a lot of load. But I'd have to think of the structural analysis here to assert that this adds to the structural ability of it. I would think it would create stress concentrations. You want to uniformly distribute the loads typically, especially a dynamic load of a railroad engine going either way above. But this is beautiful regardless. This is a picture of my wife in 1992. Took her to Paris for her birthday, and then visited my uncle in Belgium. Then, again, the previous picture was more recent with my son. My wife and I, we didn't have children. My son was born in 97, so this is 92. We were married in 98, or 88. And so you see this is Zell. This is on the Mosel River, tributary to the Rhine, feeds to the Rhine, and Berg Elt's big castle's right there. The Mosel Valley is beautiful. It's vineyards are all on the sides of these steep hills on either side of the Mosel River. So here's one of my projects, renovation project, the ceiling plane, and this is you can see the before up above here with the pink walls. That ceiling's just about caving in. They're 2x4s spanning 20 feet, more than a 20-foot span, 2x4s holding up 1.5 inches of plaster. And then the ceiling, the attic was being used too. They're lucky this ceiling didn't cave in on them. But just regardless of the structural problems here, think of just the space, how cramped it is, and then you see how I fixed that below. with the blue walls. So I built all that. Engineered, architect, and builder. So this is what it looked like. Then I did this, which is structured, and I think I've got to think of the whole roof structure too. So essentially, I'm making trusses of sorts, with pretty stiff moment connections. That there's no struts up there. I don't like to put struts. If you make a truss, the problem with trusses are the struts, between the rafters and the floor joist part, can interfere with the floor space above if you're going to use it. And make it difficult to put the floor in and just get in the way. And so this it is a truss, but with moment connections. The moment is a torque where the connection between the floor joist and the roof are beefed up so that it works as one solid form of structure. And good beefy, good sized floor too to hold up the load for storage above. No deflection. You want to use deflection as the ruling criteria in structural design in a lot of cases, even though you design for for shear and for flexure and for compression and torsion, for failure prevention. That's critical, of course, but then the deflections end up ruling not just by code what's allowed, but beef it up a little more just so there's not perceived vibrations or any sag at all. Even a little bit of deflection can crack your drywall joints and to make people uncomfortable when they're walking, or more, they're dancing or doing something. You don't want to feel the floor. So a lot of finish work too. This was quite a bit of work. You can see some of the details here. Details, ceiling plane, finishing that off. So more in ceiling planes. You put holes in the ceiling and skylights, and you're certainly opening up the space and defining it in a completely different way. You let the sunlight in, and it's orchestrating. You're orchestrating the sun. Like in music, Frank Lloyd Wright would say, orchestrate the sun in his organic architecture. So here's a project where I put these skylights in. There was no southern facing. Now typically you don't want to put your skylights southern facing because of the heat gain and the glare, so I didn't need to put mini blinds on these. But this was a somewhat dark room with only a north face, and there was a western window too, but it's somewhat blocked by a building up on a hill with sunlight. So this really let a lot of sun in. So you get a feel for that. See how this changed the space. Also, I can't say Frank Lloyd Wright gave me this idea or the Japanese design, but this is a common thing to do where you let the sun in, you let views, use frame views of the outside, but you provide privacy. So you don't put these windows all the way down to where people could see you from the outside, but you can see the outside's coming in, not just the sun, but the views also. And I had other work on this project too. I didn't take pictures of. We did bathrooms, landscaping, and things like that. So the form, color, texture, and pattern of the ceiling can define the space as well as the quality of the light and sound within. These are acoustical clouds. I've taught a number of lectures on architectural acoustics and did a little bit of consulting in the firm, San Francisco firm, where I did mostly structural and environmental engineering and architecture. But this, and that whole course in acoustics, it's not a trivial thing. Acoustical engineer is a field in itself. You get a PhD just in that, and you probably want to get a consultant that has that much education if they're designing an auditorium for you, because it's not a trivial thing to design the acoustics well in a building. Talk about vertical elements now, columns, obelisks, towers. They generate a space around them just by virtue of sticking up out of the ground plane, the floor plane. This is a picture of me in Paris in 1992. I took my wife to Paris on her birthday. She was 27 years old. And this tower defines a space around it, beautiful park. At nighttime, it really defines a whole area of the city. Beautiful, beautiful city. I don't care much for the surrounding city of Paris other than the downtown. It's not very architecturally pleasing, a little bit dangerous. The countryside in France. If you go to France, I highly recommend the countryside, the small towns, and then do a day trip or stay a couple nights. We stayed a couple nights in a beautiful hotel right outside the opera house. That's worth doing. But if you're going to immerse yourself in Europe, I recommend staying a week or two in the French countryside in little towns, and then a couple days in the city to see the sights and feel Paris. Here's a tower in Zell, similar thing. Germany, 1992. So now this is Rome, picture I took in 2011, and you see how it generates a space. The tower defines a space around it, and so the piazza. This is St. Peter's, the Basilica, where the Pope gives his services and speeches. The Pope lives right here. This is Vatican, Vatican City, Swiss Guard. It's a separate place within Italy. It's its own thing. And it's certainly a space generated around this obelisk. Oh, this is one of my favorite places, Piazza San Marco. The first time we went, made the mistake of staying right next to this, and it was so crowded. Cruise ships come in. 15,000 people fit in this place. Don't do that. I mean, avoid that. So even that first time we went, I took a student of mine. We were presenting at a conference, a high-tech conference up in Genoa. And I took him down here. I actually started teaching him some urban design as we sat there. Even though he wasn't an architecture student, he humored me. I give him lectures on urban design. This is a long time ago. But anyway, we both were annoyed by all the crowds, and then we said, okay, what can we do? Let's avoid the day trippers that come in on the cruise ships and the trains, and we're staying right there. We'd get up just at sunrise. It was like around 6 a.m. Only photographers were out there. It's beautiful, empty piazza. And then we'd go and go further away from this during the day, or just take a nap and avoid the crowds, and then come out around 11 at night, and then they have music playing all past midnight. Several little bands. It's so big you could have beautiful little quartets or trios in 3 different places, and the music didn't interfere. A beautiful space. So anyway, this you can see now that if you move the tower off center, so you saw in St. Peter's Piazza, it was in the center and defined like a circular space. Well, no, this is askew here. So when moved off center, its field becomes more aggressive and begins to compete for visual supremacy. Visual tension is created between the point and its field. This was in Narita in Japan, so we flew into Japan. This was just an airport town that I didn't think would be that beautiful because it's, by definition, an airport town. But it's 60 miles outside of Tokyo, New Tokyo Airport. Everybody flies into Narita. And I recommend staying there. Just a beautiful, huge, couple 100-acre Japanese garden, an old town. But anyway, so this vertical element defines a space. This is the Shinto Shrine. Japanese are both Shinto and Buddhist, and the shrines are Shinto. Buddhism's more a way of life, and monks and monasteries. And although you see Shinto shrines with, to the spirits in the Buddhist temples and everywhere else. You see this tower rising up. This is one of 60 sites preserved in Kyoto. Great historic town. And one site is many buildings. This is one. Well, I'm talking about Kyoto. This is actually Narita. So, sorry, this is Narita, and I'd say equally beautiful, not on the same scale as Kyoto, but highly preserved all around here. Now, this is Osaka. Osaka is the second largest city in Japan. This is where I was a keynote speaker, and they put me up in a nice hotel and really nice dinner with sashimi and Kobe beef, and they treated us very nicely. My son was on the stage with me because he contributed. We spent a little time here, but we really were hoping to get to Kyoto as fast as possible. The conference organizers were a little annoyed that I didn't stay a little longer on either side of my talk. I stayed a couple days, but they wanted me to travel with everybody. But I kind of wanted to be on my own doing historic discovery of Kyoto, so we stayed, my son and I, 2 weeks in Kyoto. But anyway, these are two trees sticking up out of a park in Osaka. It certainly defines that space, and it complements the buildings around it. It's a very unique design. Trees certainly create points. This is on the this is in Oahu, so on the way back from Japan on this trip, we stayed in Hawaii. I almost moved to Hawaii several times. I had a couple job offers in '88 when I was starting my high-tech career. Almost went here. Both building-related things, a structural one and an environmental one. We didn't care for the housing on Oahu at that time, and plus we had a little kitty cat, our practice baby, and you have to quarantine your cat for 6 months. The islands are very careful about letting in different diseases and species, and as you imagine, they have no snakes apparently, and yeah. Anyway, that was the story, and we've been back several times. I like Oahu because it has a city, and the University of Hawaii architecture programs is very nice, and and the culture and the people, it's a little more real. I've been to Maui a couple times, and that's more of a vacation kind of place. It's livable, and Kauai is actually very beautiful. Half of the island is like the Grand Canyon, which you wouldn't imagine. But it's the Garden Island, and I haven't been to the Big Island. And this is a place we stayed up near the Brigham Young University campus in Hawaii on the northeast side of Oahu. Rented a little bungalow. It was kind of dark though, because the mountain blocked a lot of the sun. But it was beautiful when the sun managed to get to us, which was a lot of the time. So towers, vertical elements. So originally this is Windsor Castle. Windsor, it was a castle. That round part was to protect against warring in the feudal times, Dark Ages, medieval times in Europe. This is Eton College, actually a high school. This is my 21st year at Elizabethtown College as I record this lecture. I made this lecture in 2019, but I'm recording it 2020 with audio. So Eton College, this is where all the princes and, it's right next to Windsor Castle, so all the Windsor children, Prince Charles, everybody goes here. It was kind of cool. It was very cool. So now vertical elements, you can create a virtual wall, a plane, just by virtue of a cascade, a colonnade. So you're maintaining an indoor-outdoor flow, but you have a boundary. It's penetrable, but it's still a boundary. So you're defining the space, the edge of a space. Took this picture in Paris in '92. Also Paris '92. Colonnade of trees can have the same effect. This is in, what year was this? 2008. Also went back 2009 as a visiting professor and stayed for almost a month. But this is the first time there. That's my student, David Coleman. He went on to get his master's and PhD. Actually connected with people. We had an 8-hour banquet, and the dean of his graduate school just happened to be there and gave him a full scholarship just because we got to know him for 8 hours, and he got his master's. And I don't normally drink, but I think I drank 2 bottles of wine by myself over 8 hours. And that's where I got to know my professor friend, and then that led to a visiting professorship. And now they're really good friends. We just visited my wife and children, their family, his wife and children, who I had visited before with my son and by myself, but this time whole family kind of get together in Venice, in a residential neighborhood of locals. The colonnade, this is again Piazza San Marco in Venice, Venezia. This is from 2004. This is my first trip to Italy. I thought people would speak English more, and I thought I'd teach myself Italian some on the way. And now I speak, I know about 800 words and a little bit of grammar. I still don't sound like a local, but I can understand what they're saying, and they can understand me if everybody speaks slow enough. Oh, this is beautiful, and this is Rovereto. This is we're just south of Trento, where the conference was originally, and then where I taught. This is a beautiful region up in the highlands, on the foothills of the Alps, on the Italy side. Also, Austria borders there. The Brenner Pass, very famous. The only way for troops from Roman times to the world wars to get through. It's a huge gap between the Alps. And the Alps, you won't think is, compared to the Rockies, the overall altitude's not that high, but the relief is really dramatic. And I drove over the Alps from Zurich once to go teach in Trento. It took me 10 hours. 10 hours of driving. I wouldn't recommend that. Go back on, take the Autostrada. It's the Austrian version of the German Autobahn. It's like 5.5 hours. If you want to go from Zurich to Italy, driving, I recommend trains. I normally always take trains. But this is another colonnade. This is in Rome. Beautiful sycamores. Everything's so well done. Most of Italy. Most of the historic things. Not everything, but here's a colonnade in Mons, Belgium. I already talked about that. Here's another colonnade in Kyoto, in the neighborhood we stayed. This canal really defined the neighborhood. It fed into a bigger river. We found, if you ever watch a movie with Marlon Brando called Sayonara, and it says it's all filmed in other locations in Japan, but my son and I, we know it had to be filmed right here. If you look where his friend's house is, you'll see this canal. Well, you maybe have to be there to appreciate it. Colonnade, this is Buddhist temple in Kyoto. Vertical elements defining the space. So now you make a canopy with your 4 posts, and you can have a ceremonial kind of space defined around that. This is in Kyoto, defining the space with the vertical elements of the columns defining that space, as well as the overhead plane. Trees in a grove. This is the bungalow in Oahu. We stayed, and my wife and daughter met us here, and my son and I on our way back from Japan. There's the thickness of the jungle in Hawaii. This is, if you look carefully here, these are very poisonous. You see those wires? Those round things are eggs, and that centipede is pretty nasty. It's white. This is the Johnson Wax Building by Frank Lloyd Wright in Wisconsin. These columns are very controversial. You can see in other courses I teach about how he was questioned by engineers at the time. Then he made a mock-up and loaded the thing with twice the weight that it would carry under design load. Still didn't fail. And then he said, add a whole bunch more, and much more load went on before it actually did fail. But you can see how these vertical elements define this space, as well as the lily pad kind of effect that he's doing above with those skylights. That whole area in between is skylights made of plastic tubing. A pretty innovative use of materials. Vertical elements and the grid defining the space. So this is a floor plan of a typical a curtain wall of the high-rise building. Where you make a shell and then you build out with tenant improvements. This is the kind of thing I did for developers in Texas and California. We built shells, and then with the space planners and designers, design the interior space each time there was a tenant, give them so much of a square foot allowance of tenant improvements, and they'd use that to build out their space. You build the shell first with a central core and curtain wall exterior. So we're talking about the vertical elements here, defining the space. And a grid, and so there's a number of different things. Le Corbusier's can be attributed to a lot of some of the original, let's say high-rises, but mostly the large apartment building project complexes. I don't care for so much. It's interesting what he did at first and his modular design concepts. Certainly architecture theory is worth noting, but it led to a lot of inner city housing projects and Soviet type housing, which I think is somewhat impersonal, not human scale. I mean, interiors are meant to be. You look at Corbusier's theory, but then if you ever walk through some of these spaces, these high-rise housing projects, you may think differently. The shape, color, and pattern of the wall can determine how much of a separation or a unifying element it is between two spaces. The height of the wall certainly can affect whether it's used as a seating element or whether or not you can see over it and how that affects the connectivity between the spaces, or if it obstructs your vision, how much of an enclosure it makes of the space you're in. The color, texture, and pattern of the plane also affects your perception of the visual weight, scale, and proportion, and where the plane is with respect to volumes of space. Where that wall is affects the connectivity between the two, whether it's connecting them or separating them. A wall plane, when a wall is standing alone, like this arch. This is the entrance to the Colosseum in Rome. There's me standing there in 2011. And so, a single plane can, with some penetrations, can define the gateway, the entrance to an area. So the wall plane is certainly critical in defining our space, as well as the ceiling plane. The exterior facade wall planes can define the interior, as well as the interior defining the exterior. So you can imagine the space within defined by this exterior wall. And so here's an example of how that curved exterior wall defines the interior space. This is a castle in Belgium. Here's me looking out the window of that castle. And a picture of the ceiling. And here you can see how that curved wall defines the exterior architecture of the castle. So a wall certainly has more of a presence than a colonnade in defining the edges of the space, and when combined with the floor plane and a ceiling plane, it's defining its space very unique. You can see how it can be passive as a backdrop. You don't want your gallery walls to be too profound. The Guggenheim is sometimes criticized because the building itself is what people are going to see a lot, and your galleries should be focused, or should focus the attention of the visitors on the exhibits. So for the most part, you want it to be a backdrop. Or can it insert itself as a form in itself? Here, the way these walls are done, something that's drawing your attention to those shapes. If you do an accent wall, certainly it can have an effect in itself of defining a unique element within the space. Accent wall. You can imagine if that was white, how that would be different. It asserts itself. Accent wall. Even if you just texture it, it's still different, even though it's the same color. Now this is actually a partition wall, but it's still an accent wall. So wall plan, here's a design of mine in California, in San Diego. Was a professor of mine. He was my urban design history professor. He was from Italy. He was Italian and went to the University of Florence, which I later visited. And so he let me design and renovate his house and stay in it for a couple months, simultaneous to other things I was doing. Well, it was in the summer, so I didn't have the urban design courses at the time. But I was working at the Planning Commission all around this time. So I made just a little quick model. He's an architect, so I didn't need to do too much. And then most of the work here after the initial design was in the carpentry. So you see the details there. And this is all my design. He let me do that even though he's an architect. No, I certainly had some say over whether or not what I was doing was good. So both he and his wife were pretty happy with the end results here. This is in the 1980s, where maybe this color scheme's not so relevant today, but this was in the 80s. This was pretty fashionable, and I think it stood the test of time. Also worked around a fireplace here, made a curved wall, a curved bench. So curving the wall, it's not a trivial thing to curve a wall. So, I had to score and wet the sheetrock and do it in several layers of thin 1/4-inch sheetrock and lay out the studs accordingly to get a nice even curve. Here are some final pictures I took. On the right, the last picture just before we moved away from San Diego. Lived there for about 3 years, and then moved up to San Francisco a couple of years. And my wife and I were just moving up there. And I was getting these final pictures at the end here, and it was a roll of film that back in the days we have a roll of film and a camera. You couldn't see the picture until you sent it away and waited a week or so for it to get developed and come back in the mail. Unfortunately, cut off the top here, so that's what it says. Last photo on roll of film caused image exposure defect. And so there's a somewhat before and after kind of thing. You can see the old crappy door I took off, put on a new door, mortised in the hinges and the lock set, beveled the edge. So more in defining the space here. So an L-shaped configuration can define a space with a solid corner. And then if you separate that corner, make it not a fixed corner, one of the arms can incorporate the corner while the other is seen as an appendage. So it's an interesting way to play with the form. Now, you can just do that with a door, but if you move the whole wall, it has a different effect. So defining space, a void is introduced to one side of the corner of the configuration, and the definition of the field will be weakened. The two planes will be isolated from each other, and one will appear to slide by and visually dominate the other. So you see how just opening up that corner affects the space on the top pair of pictures. And if you open up the corner by pulling both walls back, that's a completely different way the space is now defined. Not just at the corner, but the whole interior space within. So you can play with the way you define spaces, and I'm going very rapidly through this. This really should be a 2-part lecture series. It should take 2 different hours to look at this. I'm going through fast so it can store as one solid thing. I'll come back and look at these things. The corner can be an independent element that joins the 2 planes. Post. Parallel planes define a space, a corridor. You can see the way these units lie out. Come back, take a look at that. This is in Milan. I didn't take this picture, but I've been to Milan. My favorite city, the Lake Districts north of it, I think are beautiful. Other cities I like better. But you can see how this space is defined with these planes. If you put three walls together and make a pocket, it defines, kind of captures that space. If you put something for it to focus when you're in it, looking out, like an obelisk, then that can certainly enhance that space and give a greater sense of closure. And of course, four planes, walls define a space, well-defined, enclosed space. I do come back and take a look at these and digest them. We're going very fast, so the properties of enclosure and the quality of the space and how each one of those varies. The form of the building both impacts and is influenced by the nature of the site and context, always. Not just Frank Lloyd Wright organic architecture, all architecture should be that way. Respond to the structures, the topography, and the spatial conditions. So you see an urban scale, urban design, cascade of buildings, and then one building, how it affects others, a backdrop, how a corner, two buildings can define a space, a piazza down below, or in the pocket, magnify an object within. This is San Francisco. My sister, actually, when we lived in San Francisco, was right to the right here in one of these houses. Not one of these, but 2 houses over. This is a beautiful San Francisco cascade of buildings, designing a fabric, continuity buildings. This is the Guggenheim, Frank Lloyd Wright, and you can see, and there's Central Park and how the buildings around it create a backdrop for it. And it was actually, there's the addition, the building immediately adjacent to it, that was the thought process. That went up after the Guggenheim, but the idea was not to overshadow it. Although I still don't care for it, but the real estate's so expensive that you know something's going to go up there. Now this is a space on the Elizabethtown College campus, an outdoor space defined by these 2 dormitories. And I brought this up through a couple different administrations and college, and working with different senior staff and the trustees and some committees, and my students certainly, over a number of years. This space, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, that's Alpha Hall, which is the administrative building with the president and all the senior staff, and our beautiful library up on the left. And then there's a parking lot here. And there's also a nice garden that was donated by some of the graduating students one year. You can see right to the left of the parking lot. But then that parking lot, and it's not a lot of vehicles, really disrupts this space, and in my opinion, what could be a better use for this area, potentially new quad. And nobody uses the ornamental garden, probably because it's just next to the parking lot. But imagine that whole quad as one green space, and maybe if you want to make good academic use out of it, put a little amphitheater in there, or even a water feature gathering kind of place, a gathering focal point. So, I've discussed this with students over the years. Could do much more right in here. Some more pictures of that space. So, facades serve as walls that define courtyards, streets, public gathering places. Yes, the walls define the outdoor spaces as well. So the way a piazza or courtyard is defined by the adjacent buildings. Certainly Piazza San Marco, the Basilica of San Marco, and the Loggia, I believe it's called. This was a government center. This was the center of all activity during some of the Middle Ages, where dangerous to go by land a lot of the times, and people lived in castles and things. And then coming out of that in the Renaissance, the trade routes and the waterways were vital. And so this was a serious center of world governance in the Western world. So Piazza San Marco again. Can't get enough of that. I don't get tired of looking at pictures of this. Hopefully you don't either. So building design. At the scale of the building site, a building can form a wall along an edge, define outdoor space, merge interior space and private outdoor space in the walled site. See that in a number of warmer climates, also in the Japanese design and Chinese design, and frankly Wright design some. Close a portion of the site as an outdoor room, an L shape, or just completely surrounded as a courtyard. You see this dating back to Roman times, Chinese times, 2,000 years ago, and Spanish times too. At the scale of my site, building can dominate the site through its form. It can stretch out and present a broad face to address a view. It can stand free within its site, but extend its exterior space to merge with private exterior space. And it could stand as a positive form in a negative space. So here are some examples of these forms. Wall helping define the outdoor space. A couple walls defining this space. L-shaped forms defining this pool area. An indoor-outdoor kind of field defined here. You find this in the Japanese and frankly Wright and other things, and Engawa and verandas. This is in four walls. Certainly make a plaza, piazza, a courtyard, is padua. Single wall. This is a curved crescent building in England, very famous building defining this whole area in front of the building by virtue of its curved shape. This is Monticello in Virginia. I've been there a number of times since 35 years ago. This is a famous design on top of a hill. And he also designed the University of Virginia, you see off to the left. This building dominating the site on the top of the hill. Not something Frank Lloyd Wright would have done in his organic design. He would build into that hill, like Taliesin, which means shining brow, and many others. Levittown after World War II, GI Bill, everybody mass-produced housing, everybody gets a house, and so here you can see the building can stand as a positive form in a negative space. To the parallel planes, floor and ceiling, certainly something you see Frank Lloyd Wright doing with the cruciform and the prairie style. So we see that these two planes, parallel planes, form a spatial zone between them, and this is noted in Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water from our book by Francis Ching. The reinforced concrete slabs of falling water express the horizontality of the floor and roof planes as they cantilever outward from the central vertical core. And here's a quote from Frank Lloyd Wright from his book The Natural House. I had an idea that the planes parallel to the earth in buildings identify themselves with the ground. I began to see a building as a broad shelter in the open, related to vista, vista without, and vista within. I was born an American child of the ground and space, welcoming spaciousness as a modern human need. The farm had no negligible share in developing this sense of things in me, I am sure. He grew up on the Wisconsin farmland. Some pictures I found of different seasons, just off the internet, looking for seasonal pictures of falling water. Complements the site, all 4 seasons. Spring also, summer. Field trip we cover in other classes. I talk about my Frank Lloyd Wright series. Took the students there. Number of faculty involved. You may recognize some of them. Field trip, again, we talk about this much in other lectures series, my lecture series in Frank Lloyd Wright. Then the perceived volume by virtue of, this is in Kyoto, the columns and beams forming perceived volume. This skeleton beneath the skin, there's a whole lecture that I do just on this. Have students make barns just so you perceive the skeleton and the perceived volume by virtue of the skeleton. This project I talk about, this is one of my projects, my most recent project, and other lectures. And certainly all the framing, old and new, the bones of the building, the skeleton of the building, define the volume within. Some details of the barn structure I had to beef up, and what I'm doing with the barn. And so now windows, you want to pay close attention to how the windows affect light. So openings connect space to its context. Windows allow daylight to penetrate and illuminate offer views, relationship with the adjacency of spaces. Ventilation, very important nowadays, fresh air. Doorways offer an entry and influence patterns of movement within. One single opening won't weaken an edge or a sense of enclosure. Multiple openings can do that, but they can also form a unified composition or be staggered to disperse and create visual movement along the plane. As the opening increases in size, it at some point cease to be a figure within an enclosed field and become an element in itself. So a band of windows is actually a thing in itself. And then horizontal opening extending across the wall begins to visually lift the ceiling plane from the wall plane and gives it a feeling of lightness. So you're affecting the entire volume of the space and the feeling of the ceiling as well. Here's a picture from my project here. I'm capturing the views, and it's certainly an element in itself. This banding of windows. Perhaps thought of from Frank Lloyd Wright 50 years ago when I first looked into this stuff, and growing up on the Philadelphia Main Line, looking at the English Tudor mansions where they do this also, long before Frank Lloyd Wright's time. Well, the mansions were done right at the same time as Frank Lloyd Wright, but the English Tudor that was inspired by is long before that, a couple hundred years before that. Nevertheless, it's, I think, a very good architectural thing to do. And then more on these windows. A window wall allows more daylight in views and visually expands the space beyond physical boundaries. So you're inside, outside, like Japanese Igawa, like Frank Lloyd Wright organic design, and like what I like to do. Opening along edges visually weakens corners as openings increase. So you destroy the box if that's what you want going for. That's what Frank Lloyd Wright wants to do. And so he had many corner windows with no mullions, in between. And that's quite a feat of craftsmanship. Then locating a skylight along an edge where a wall and ceiling planes meet allows daylight to wash the surface wall, illuminate it, and enhance the brightness of the space. Be careful doing a little bit too much of that. At some point, the space no longer functions or is perceived as a separate space. Combining a window wall with a large skylight obscures the boundaries between inside and outside, and the building loses its sense of enclosure. Yes. So the Engawa, again, we're going very rapidly through this lecture. Come back and look at this if you haven't already been assigned to watch this. This is a very good Japanese television video on the Engawa, the enclosed porch space. More than that, it's part of the building. It's not just enclosing a porch. The partitions in the walls, the screens, allow for an open floor plan, so it's really a continuation of interior space into the exterior. So again, Frank Lloyd Wright would often say, destroy the box, open up the space. In both the interior walls and exterior. Like this is an amazing feat of craftsmanship. Now this has been reconstructed after the structural retrofitting, the post-tension of slabs. And so perhaps this seam wasn't as seamless in the 1930s when it was first made, but this is, even today, quite a feat to have. You cannot see that seam. You can't even perceive that corner seam in that glass. That's pretty amazing craftsmanship. So here's another Cascade Windows. And a similar thing I'm doing in my house, again, not directly influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, but who knows, maybe I saw something in the 50 years ago that reminded me to do this. It just seemed like a great idea to frame the views. And then light, and the way you deal with light is very important. So you reveal shapes, colors, and textures. Shifting patterns of light, shade, shadows, sunlight articulates the form. The sun animates the space. The color and brilliance of the sunlight can create a festive atmosphere, right? The feeling of the space. A room full of more diffuse light can be somber. So what effect are you going for? Is this a library? Is this a living room? Is this a kitchen? A breakfast nook? Maybe you want to put on the east side of the house where the sun rises and it's a bright thing, or on the west side, as you're relaxing after work or school, you want it maybe a little more somber, or in a church setting. How do you want to play with that light? Direct sunlight creates sharp patterns of light and dark and articulates the form very crisply. The shape of the opening also is reflected in the cast shadow that's created. The color and texture of forms and surfaces affect the reflectivity and ambient light level within the space. So that's very important. You can do light tunnels, bringing in light into the buildings. You can play with reflectance to either bring in more sunlight or actually reduce heat gain. Learn about that in green architectural engineering. What are you trying to do? And the reflectance of the surfaces, both interior and exterior, as you channel light into the building as well as heat. What are you going for? In Arizona, you don't want to bring in the direct sunlight heat in the middle of the day. Perhaps in the north you do want to do that more. So we will also learn to control the light in courses such as my green architectural engineering course, where you want to modulate, and even with mechanical controls at times, the amount of light coming in for heat gain, the sunlight, natural daylight, whether you want it in or not, depending if it's creating glare or if it's diffused, what side of the building it's on, what time of year it is, and same with the heat gain. And in general, for studios, architecture studios and art studios, you want to design them, create those studios with northern light, with northern windows, north-facing windows, because then that light is not so variable. You have a consistent, non-glare, kind of diffused light coming in. So even if the forms themselves aren't part of what's letting the light in, there can be shadows created that enhance or detract from the architecture. The quality of the sunlight, whether it's diffuse or not, or direct, varies by time of day, season, place, where you are in the globe, the latitude of your location, the sun angles, and the different seasons where the sun rises and sets. You may want the sun coming in the morning in the breakfast nook. You may want it in the east, and you may want the sunset viewed out your living room windows in the west. You got to be careful with solar heat gain through the west as well as the south. The south certainly is where the abundance of sun is, but there's a thermal lag we'll learn about in the courses such as green architectural engineering, where the building will heat up over the day and actually can get the hottest if there's too much western fenestration, too many windows on the western elevation of the building. And as sunlight is dispersed by clouds, haze, and precipitation, it transmits the changing colors of the sky and the weather to the forms and surfaces it illuminates. So you may want those colors of the sunset coming in, depending on how you're orchestrating the sunlight and bringing it into your building. There's beautiful sunsets in the desert and Texas and Arizona, but again, be careful of how much fenestration you have on that western wall, because those are very high heat gain places. So you may have a beautiful sunset to watch, but you may be baking in the space because you let too much sunlight in. So be careful with that, and think about the colors. In the morning, it's different too. That you don't have that thermal gain of the daylight heating up the building. So maybe you want the direct sunlight coming in the morning, maybe to wake you up in the bedroom, maybe in the breakfast nook, and the colors of the sunrise too. So the different size of the opening can affect the amount of light, heat, and sound you let in. We talk about acoustics too in a number of my courses in green architectural engineering and other courses too. It's architectural as well as engineering concept, and how does that affect the space? So these openings seriously affect the space in many ways. I already mentioned in this project of mine, orchestrating the sun as well as the thermal and natural daylighting effects varied per season based on the orientation of the sun and the placement and the height of the windows. Windows and skylights establish a relationship between a room and its surroundings. Japanese would certainly agree, the Ingawa, Frank Lloyd Wright, organic architecture as well. Window and skylights establish a relationship between the room and surroundings, yes. A small opening can be like a painting on the wall. A group of windows, if they're apart, can invoke a sense of movement between spaces, outdoor spaces. A long, narrow opening up high can hint at what's beyond and give you some views while maintaining privacy. So the opening, as it gets bigger, can dominate the space you're within. You may not want to do it so much in an inner city down on the first floor looking out on the street, but if you have some nice views you want to bring in or in a garden, then certainly. The second picture here, you can direct the viewer by strategically putting the window in a certain place. And then the third picture, the bay window is nice if it projects out, actually allow people to sit and feel like they're part of the outside space, maybe with a window bench. Again, here's my most recent Pennsylvania project as I'm framing the views of the neighboring farmland. Again, capturing the views here of the sky as well as the this 200-acre farmland of Amish right over there, and they out that window they plow that with a mule team. Very picturesque. In this bedroom of my Lancaster County project, you can see that I put a very small eyebrow window that frames a holly tree, and you can see it on the left here from a bathroom in another part of the house, and on the right how it's framing just a little view. You can see the birds and the trees sometimes. Here's another place where I put in a window. It's for a view as well as like a painting on the wall. This is in the shop area of the house. And there it is, framing the views as well as being a painting on the wall. And here you can see this window from a little further away in the shop area that was added on to the 1800s house prior to my renovating. On the left there, that little square window was a outhouse that I filled in and took out the back wall, made steps going down the back for going in and out of the shop area. This is details you can come back in later if you're in the architecture theory class. You want to certainly, this is an assignment for you, but to design a grand window. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright's organic design is something you definitely want to think about in detail. And so this is now an accumulation of many years of readings and experiences, and my interpretation of Frank Lloyd Wright's organic design, organic architecture design principles. And you'll see that I put an asterisk next to the ones that I have demonstrated in this lecture that you just listened to. So I won't go through all of these here because this is covered in Frank Lloyd Wright lecture series I have, and it takes more than just a quick couple minutes to look at. And there's a whole lecture series here of 7-8 hours of things, actually more like 20 if you take your time going through them, even though I narrate very quickly. And part of that you'll see his childhood, his formative years, and influences that I note, and all the references that go into that lecture series. as well as the 7 architecture courses I've taught. Actually 9 depending on how you count it, but 7 certainly different courses. And also my YouTube channel where you'll find this lecture among many other things. Each part of this lecture series is available in a number of different file formats. There are links that you can click on in the PDFs and the PowerPoints, not in the YouTube or MP4. However, on the YouTube videos, you'll see in the comments a link to the PDF and the PowerPoints. So this is the last slide. Looks like it took an hour and 18 minutes, a little bit over. To go through this, all this very quick. You really should do this in 2 parts. Break it in half and go through slowly. Use the PowerPoint PPTX with audio is my advice for your first choice, because then you can stop and go to links. You can certainly do the PDF too, but then you don't have the audio with that. And if you do the MP4, you're not going to have the links or in YouTube either. So my recommendation is the PPTX with audio. It'll take a little while to download, but it'll be a more rewarding experience. And so this again is the end of part 3 on Architectural Design Theory lecture series on form and space, this particular lecture.